The old steel radiator rattled and shook and quaked and quivered and made the strangest noises in the middle of the night, and he was there to try and fix it. It wasn't his house, this was his friend's house. Now, this man was strong, but he wouldn't have said that he was tall, and he certainly wouldn't have said that he was thin. But he was a happy man, except when he was woken in the middle of the night to come and fix a radiator, even if it was his friend's. He was using an old, cold, rusty spanner that used to belong to his grandfather. He was pulling and pushing at the radiator that still made the strangest of noises. It wasn't that the radiator that was filled with water wasn't keeping the house hot. It was keeping the house hot. But it was also filling the house with terrible noises. Now, as he was working, he was pulling and pushing with that old rusty spanner that used to belong to his grandfather, and he looked, and he wondered, and he scratched at his chin, and he tried to think how he was going to be able to fix this radiator. And then an owl hooted in the middle of the night. If there was anything that he didn't like, apart from getting up in the middle of the night, it was the sound of owls and creatures and beasts that might stalk the night. And he took that spanner that was in his hand, and it slipped and it fell right down. He was shaking so much he could barely tighten up the thread on the nuts and the bolts. He wondered what he was going to do. He looked and he tried to pretend that he was as brave as he possibly could. And he got hold of the spanner again, and he pushed and he pulled, and when he pushed and he pulled, the spanner fell down onto the beautiful old white Wilton carpet. He thought he'd fixed the radiator, but now he'd made a mess of the carpet. He took a pair of scissors that were long and sharp, bright shining steel, and he started to try and cut out the part of the carpet that had been marked by the old rusty spanner. When his friend came in to see just how well he was doing with the radiator that was making such a terrible noise, he looked, and the noise started again. The radiator started to shake and shiver and quake and quiver. But it wasn't that. When the friend looked down and saw the mark on the carpet and how he was trying to cut out the piece of carpet that had been marked, he started to jump up and down, dancing, screaming, yelling and shouting. And as he did so, the radiator stopped. The noise stopped. "You've come here, and I could have fixed it myself," said his friend. "I could have done that myself." He was so angry that he shooed his friend right out of the house. Now here's a strange thing. The noise of the radiator had stopped, but the next day, through the letterbox, there came a letter that floated its way down and landed on the mat at the front of the plumber's house. And he looked at it, and it wasn't him saying thank you for fixing my radiator. It wasn't him being grateful. It was a bill. A bill? The plumber wasn't going to charge his friend no matter what. It was a bill to fix the carpet. They weren't very friendly towards each other after that. But I will tell you one thing. In the middle of the night, sometimes the plumber would be coming back along the street, and he would see his friend, and he would hear that rattle and throb of the old steel radiator making a noise, and by the shadow that was cast on the side of the window, he would see his friend having to dance as best as he could, up and down, to try and make this radiator stop. She hated the way that her fingernails were always filled with dirt. She would have been happy otherwise. This girl, she was always dirty, but she would rather have been clean. Her job was to look after the cows. She would have to go past the potato fields and she'd have to look after the cows and pull up turnips and carrots and food for the family and for the cows. But this farm was old and run down and ramshackle. The only thing that would ever bring her any kind of pleasure would be when she sang, and this was what she did very well. Her voice was as sweet as honey in the air. She loved to sing. And now, as it was getting closer and closer towards autumn, she knew that he would be coming to the town. He would be there with his guitar, with its long, straight, silvery steel strings that he could play beautifully. She loved the way that this travelling man would come every autumn, come to their town, and she would listen to him, and she would watch him, and she would wish that she could have a guitar like him. She could feel the cold steel strings underneath her fingers. At first, she would watch him, and she would move her fingers backwards and forwards across the strings. She would imagine what it would be like to have a guitar herself. This man, he came every autumn. He had a guitar in front of him. He had a drum on his back with a cymbal on the top, and when he walked, you could always tell by the step bang of the drum as he played. She wished that she could have had long, straight, clear nails like him, for he played the guitar beautifully. His fingernails ran all over the strings, and she often wondered how strings that were made out of steel could sound as sweet as a bird's song. She loved this travelling man who would come and sing, and when he did sing, there would be a smile on her lips, because she knew that she could sing better than him. And still she wanted to have his guitar. Still she wanted to be able to learn how to play just like him. And now, on this cold, breezy autumn morning, as she was going towards the cow shed, she had a secret. A terrible secret. She had wanted to have his guitar so much that one day when the teacher's back was turned, she had stolen a guitar from the school. She'd taken it. There was no way about it. When she played it, she felt guilty. When she sang, well, her voice wasn't as sweet, because always she thought that with this stolen guitar, these were stolen songs that she was singing. The guitar that she'd taken from the school didn't have steel strings. It had strings that were made out of catgut, nylon strings. They made a rounder sort of sound, not as sharp or as sweet as the guitar strings that he had. She couldn't really play the guitar in front of everybody. She couldn't take it into the house to show her mother and father or sister or brothers. She had to hide it in the cowshed. She would hide it in the cowshed, and the only people who got to hear her were the cows. She kept the guitar behind some old rusty gates that she knew would never be used again. She hid it there, and the cows, as they would listen to her singing, they would moo in appreciation. Her father, the farmer, loved the fact that the cows were starting to give more milk. She liked to think that it was because of her singing. What she really wanted was her dream to come true, that she would be able to sing for everybody. She would wish, but not out loud. She would only wish inside of her head that she would learn to play the guitar as well as the travelling man who would come round every autumn, that she would have clean fingers to play the guitar strings with, and she would always wish it inside of her head. One day, she raised back the rusty gates, she took out the guitar, and she started to play. But behind the rusty gates there was a mirror. It was an old mirror. It was oval, it was dusty, it was like a looking glass from a long time ago, and it was covered in cobwebs. She'd never really noticed it, but it just seemed that the way that the light had come in through the top of the cowshed, and she could see herself playing. She quite liked the way that it looked. Her singing was just like her singing always was, only this time it was a bit louder. She kept singing, she kept playing, she kept admiring herself in the looking glass. And then she heard a sound that she recognised. Step, bang, step, bang, step, bang. "Well, me dear, you're a good singer, and there's no doubt about that. All of this while I've been watching you, watching me, as I've been playing the guitar, and you're much better." And when he looked at the guitar, you could see that it had written on the top the name of the school where she'd stolen it from. "Oh, I don't like the look of that. I tell you what I'll do. I'll say I found the guitar on the road, and I'll take it back to the school, in exchange for you teaching me how to sing as well as you do. And if I become as good a singer as you, then I'll give you one of me old guitars." The girl couldn't believe it, to have a guitar that really belonged to her. Oh, she taught him how to sing, and he taught her how to play those steel strings so that they were as sweet as her voice. Day by day, she became better upon those steel strings. Day by day, she could sing in front of people instead of cows. But if you looked towards her fingernails, because of the work that she did on the farm, there was always just a little bit of dirt underneath her fingernails. This little girl didn't live in a small house. No, she lived in a huge mansion that was white and wide with gates at its front. And she was a happy girl, generous, kind, but loud. Sometimes people would say that when she opened her mouth, it almost made the short and curly hair on the top of her head move from side to side. Her eyes were small, and so was her mouth, but it was always with a huge smile upon her lips that she would go around. Not that she would go outside of the mansion that often. But on this dark Sunday summer's morning, she'd been told by the doctor that she needed to take more exercise because she was thin and she wasn't very strong. Now, she decided that she wasn't going to run outside, but she was going to walk briskly. She had a short-sleeved dress on her back and shiny shoes on her feet and a belt at her waist, and in this long thin dress she was going to go out into the park that was there by the side of the steelworks. I've told you already, the doctor had said that she needed to take more exercise, and the only time that she could think that she could go out would be on a Sunday morning before chapel. As she was out, she wasn't sure, and she pulled at the collar around her neck. She wasn't sure, but she could see someone or something out by the edge of the park. She wasn't sure what or who it was, but as she got closer she could see that it was a girl, and the girl was reaching down towards the muddy ground, and the girl pulled up from out of the rubbish a chicken leg. A chicken leg that someone else had already taken a bite out of, and now she was eating at it. This rich girl looked and thought, how could she possibly be eating food that other people have thrown away? the chicken leg was dirty and dusty, and so was this girl. I've got to tell you, this rich girl, whose name was Liberty, looked and said, "How can you eat that?" "How can I eat this?" said the girl. "How can I eat this? Very easily." And here she took another bite. "Very easily indeed." She could hear that the dust and the dirt and the mud on the chicken leg was crunching on the girl's teeth. She was shocked. "Where's your mother and your father?" "Oh, my mother's working. She's working at the coal. She's got to sort out all of the different lumps of coal. She works on the screens to make sure all of the pieces of coal are the right size for going into the steelworks." And it was here that this dusty and dirty girl looked at her. "And the way that I see it, probably your father owns it." She was shocked. "And where's your father?" "My father's at the wars. At the wars, wherever there's a war, they need steel, they need iron. And he's getting the iron ore that goes into the steelworks that makes the ships and guns." She looked down at her own clean and shiny shoes, and she was shocked again, because this dirty and dusty girl had no shoes on her feet. I've told you already that this girl was loud, and when she got back home, she said to her mother in a loud voice, "There are children out there who have no parents to look after them, who have to eat dirty chicken, who have to look after themselves, who are covered from the top of their heads to the tips of their toes in dirt, and their parents have to work for you." She pointed at her father. Her father could only take so much. "Don't you talk to me like that, girl." But she wasn't going to be stopped. With her voice, she told everyone about the way that the children were treated, about the way that no one would be able to look after them, because the parents would be working in the steelworks, that they had rags on their backs and no shoes on their feet. And perhaps it was just the fact that she kept on saying it, not too loudly, that it would hurt people's ears, but she would keep on saying it, so that the conditions for the children would not change overnight, but they would become better, that the children would be given food to eat, clean food, that the children would have shoes on their feet, that the children would not have to work from the dawning of the day till the time that the sun would go down. When she became a woman, she felt pleased that in her own loud way she'd help the children inside of the ironworks. This boy was happy being lazy. He was bored and not short of a bob or two inside of his pocket. He would pull his small hands through his long straight hair and look around. One of his friends had come over to stop at his house, and they'd tried playing football inside of the house. Well, his mother and his father were not pleased at all. The two of them. They could have played other games inside of the house. But on this dry summer's afternoon in 1993, they thought that the only thing that they could do would be to go outside. His short-sleeved shirt was dirty. Dirty because he hardly ever washed his hands or his face. And strange to say, he would wipe his hands on his short-sleeved shirt, look down at his ripped jeans and smile to himself. "I like being dirty. I like mud and dirt all over me, so I might play a bit of football." Well, the two of them did try to play football outside, but they got too noisy and they were told to stop. The dust was rising, and the sun was high in the sky, and rather than go back into the house and trample dust on their sandalled feet all the way back through the house, they decided to go and look inside of the hut at the bottom of the garden. There were lots of different things inside, all sorts of different things, and one of the things that they found inside was a box that had a handle on the side. Now, they didn't know what it was, but they knew it was very old. It was also very heavy. When they clicked it open, they looked inside, and there they could see that there were pieces that were made out of iron and steel. There was a fine needle at the bottom. There was a heavy plate that went round and round. It was an old record player, and it belonged to their nanny. It was his nanny's old record player. They started to play with the records inside, some of which had pieces broken out of them. But they put it on, and they switched it on, and they heard the strangest sounds you ever did hear. They laughed. They smiled. They couldn't believe it. How could anybody ever get any pleasure from this scritch and scratch of music? They started to dance around inside of the old shed, and it was no better than when they'd been inside of the house trying to play football. They knocked the record player over, and the huge, hard, heavy iron plate that the records rested on fell to the ground and broke on the stone floor in the shed. They looked at each other. Wasn't me. Wasn't me. I didn't do anything. And it was then that they heard their nanny shouting. The nanny was shouting for them to come in and get some food. Their cheeks burned red. This boy, because he'd broken his nanny's record player, and the friend, because he'd helped him to do it. When they got inside of the house, they ate the food and felt really guilty because the nanny was being so good to them. They didn't know who to ask. They didn't know who to ask for help. When they'd eaten the food and smiled, thank you, thank you very much, thank you very... They went back into the shed. They took the two pieces of the hard iron disc that the records rested on, and they tried to use glue. They willed the glue to keep the two halves together. But you can't mend iron and steel with glue. I know what we'll try, said one of the boys. I'll try and use some sellotape. And they pulled some sellotape, placed it on top, but as soon as they put it back and it started to go round, it fell to pieces. What are we going to do? What can we do? We can't fix this iron plate. What are we going to do? The boy knew that he was going to have to ask for help from someone. He sidled up towards his mother. Ma'am, we've broken Nanny's record player and we don't know what to do. That record player? I used to have that as a child. I could play with it and not smash things. Well, I know what we'll do, said the mother. You'll have to take it to your dad over at the works. He's good with his hands. He works with the steel and the iron. He works in the craft shop. Maybe he'll be able to put it back together again. The two boys carried the heavy, old record player. They carried it and they shouted for his dad, and his dad came out and he looked. So what have you two been doing then? What have you smashed now? Showed him. They showed him the two broken halves of the steel plate that the records rested on. I can see by the glue on the side you've tried to glue it. Well, you can't glue iron and steel together. We tried sellotape as well, said the boy's friend. Well, you need to use heat from a blowtorch, and you need to weld the two parts together. I'm very good at welding, but you had better not say anything to anyone about what you've done." They watched the father. He switched on a blowtorch that glowed white. It was so hot. And he used some metal that looked a bit like brass, and he placed it on top of the place where the two halves of the steel plate had broken. And you could hardly tell that it had been welded together. The two boys, very sheepishly, said thank you to his father and tucked it underneath their arm. As they got back, there was the nanny standing by the door. Hey, look. I don't know where you've got that from. Did you find it in the shed? I think that we could sit and we could listen to some of those old records. And then maybe... Oh, and she looked. Oh, dear. She looked at some of the old records, for bits had broken off. Those old records, they used to break up. It was a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, trying to put them together. Tell you what, and here she reached up onto a shelf and pulled down an old wooden jigsaw puzzle. And while they played records on the old record player, they made a jigsaw puzzle. But the old woman, his nanny, she told them stories about when she'd first heard the record that they were listening to. They weren't bored that day, for the old lady had so many stories to tell, and she was always reminded by the records that were played on a heavy record player that had a fixed iron plate inside that would go round and round.
Got there, the couple was there, and so the poor dog had none. Bow, wow, wow, whose dog a bow? Little Tommy Finger's dog. Bow, wow, wow.
He was not much better than skin and bone. He was thin, he was dirty. But when he worked in the mine, that was a good thing. It was a cramped place to work in, and dark. Dusty, dark, damp, and terrifying. Some would say that it was one of the worst jobs in all of the world, but this boy would take his pick and he would pull at the coal and pull it away and rake it to one side. And the fact that he was small and thin meant that he could fit into the smallest of places. It was always noisy, because he wasn't the only one who worked down the pit. There were lots of boys who had to work in that place, lots of miners, lots of men who had travelled far from other countries to come to this place. But he was hot. And when he lay down on his belly to pull at the coal, the water would flood over his waist and onto those breeches that he had on his legs. His shirt was dirty, tatty, filled with sweat. But these breeches, they didn't make them like that anymore. They were old. They'd belonged to his older brother, and they'd belonged to his grandfather before that. Now, he stopped for a moment to take a cup of water. It was cool and refreshing, even down at the coalface. He'd carried it down in a billy can. He'd used the water pump to pump the water deep from underground into the billy can, and now he was enjoying what it tasted like. The only way that he could get to see what it was that he was doing was to use a candle. He'd got a good candle, better than any he'd ever seen before. It was the only light that he had, and to know how long it was that he worked, he would use a stone and cut at the side of it, no broader than his thumb, and for every time that it burnt down past those grime-filled scratches made by a stone, he knew that an hour had passed. But this candle that he used had not been his. The food that he'd eaten had not been his, because he had taken one of the lodgers who lived in his mother and father's house. He'd taken their billy can and their bait box, because they got the best of everything, and he didn't think it was fair. There was no way that he could tell his mother and father that he didn't think it was fair, so he just took it. The food had tasted just that little bit better than it really was, because he knew this was the best food. There wasn't just one lodger inside of the house, there were two lodgers whose voices would lilt and swirl all around. It was only a 2 up and 2 down house. It was damp and smelly, with hardly anything inside. Some would say sparse. But there was one thing that was not lacking inside of the house. It was full to the brim with love and people. His brothers, his sisters. But it was the lodgers who got the best of everything, including the best seats inside of the house, by the side of the fire. They were demanding. But there was something about the way that they looked. They were very shifty. They would look underneath their brows. They would look from the corner of their eyes. But everyone was quite pleased, because they would be fed first and then they would go out. It was never said where they would go out to, but I think everyone knew, for there was a sweet and sickly smell upon their breath. But now, this boy was there working really hard underground, and then he heard a sound that everyone feared, but no one had ever heard. They feared it. They were worried, and a shout went out amongst all of the men, because they knew that the rocks were slipping one against another, slipping and falling. And as they were starting to slip and fall, he saw 2 boots that he recognised from inside of the house. One of the lodgers was reaching down for him. You've taken my food, you've taken my billy can, and now I'm going to take it out. But the sound got louder. Perhaps the boy had heard it first, because he was lying with his belly lying flatter against the stone, but he didn't wait for a moment. This lodger from his house, he just grabbed the shovel. I've got to tell you, for a moment the lodger thought he was going to be struck with it, but the boy pushed it under the rocks. Get out! The boy yelled. You could see his boots running away from that place. The next day, sitting by the table that was by the side of the range and the fire, there was one empty chair. Now there was more room inside of the house, and one less voice, and one place at the table where a plate was laid, but no food was placed on it, except the very best of food, in memory of a brave boy. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop herself being in a mood. Upset, sad. For this was a Christmas Eve, and she wondered why she still had to work at the brick factory on a Christmas Eve. She'd heard stories that those children who had more money than her family, they would get stockings that were filled with toys. An orange. She'd even heard that someone had once seen a banana. But she knew there would be nothing for her. Nothing on Christmas morning and nothing on Christmas Day. And still, she had to work inside the brick factory, taking the clay, putting it into a mould, pulling down upon the machine to press it into place, and stacking them high so that they could be taken and heated and baked into bricks. Her grandfather had told her about how people would work in this place on farms, before there were factories, before there was the company, the steelworks, the mine and the limestone works. He'd worked on his father's farm, and his job had been to help with all of the fields, to make sure that the cows were fed. But now the company needed horses. The company needed beef. For where there's work, there is a need for food. What he'd got from all of his time as working on the farm was a horseshoe nail, and she had it now, and she would wish upon it. She would wish out loud for things, and if she could have done, she would have wished to have had a family that was rich, so that she could have enjoyed a good Christmas Day with presents. But working inside of the brick factory was hot and dusty work. The clay would dry out her fingers when the bricks were baked. The wind, the draught that blew through that place would cake her skin and her clothes with brick dust and clay. It meant that she had to wear clothes that would protect her from the cold of the wind and the heat of the ovens that baked, the great kilns that baked the bricks. She had to have a hat upon her head, because if she'd left her hair to flow freely, then it would have got filled with clay dust. It would have got filled with brick dust. And if it rained on her way home, then her hair would become stiff and hard. She worked hard at the brick factory, even though she didn't like the work, and she didn't really know how much she made. Her money was paid to her father when he was paid on the long payday. But she got food, she had clothes upon her back, and she felt quite lucky. She did. There were some children who lived in this place, in Ebbw Vale. When the steelworks was smelting the ore, the air would be filled with a thick, orange, flame-filled smoke. And some children, they coughed, and she was quite lucky, for all of the smoke and dust and dirt did not affect her. She'd heard tell that the ironmaster's son had been affected, that he was a sickly kind of a child, and he was taken, along with all of the poor children, to the lime works. They would heat up the limestone and it gave off a smoke. And some people said that it would cure those children who had trouble with their breathing. It would make her cry to look and see all of those children standing in the thick white smoke, coughing worse than they had done before they'd gone to stand in the smoke. But for the likes of her, it was too expensive to go to a doctor's, so she felt lucky that at least she had her health, at least she had a job, a roof over her head, clothes upon her back. But she still wished she could have had something for Christmas Day. A horseshoe nail had been given to her by her grandfather, laid in her pocket, and in the short time that she had from her work, she could see that there was a piece of wood. If she wasn't going to have a Christmas present, she would make sure that her younger sister would have a Christmas present. And she took that horseshoe nail, brushed it against an old broken brick to make it sharp, and with a piece of wood she cut and carved out a beautiful wooden horse. She could almost imagine her sister's face when she handed it to her on Christmas Day. One of the things inside of the valley was this. There would be hooters, bells, the walking of the miners as they went to work, and she knew that soon, when she finished her work, her father, who worked in the mine, would be finishing his work, and the two of them would be able to walk home together. It wasn't far. Nobody lived very far away from the steelworks or from the mine. It was an easy walk. And she didn't know what it was, but in amongst all of those cloth-capped miners with the grime and dust upon their faces, and their hats, their cloth caps, hard upon their heads with sweat and coal dust, she didn't know what it was, but she could look amongst them all, and she would be able to recognise her own father. He would be there, with a lamp in his hand, in amongst them all, and the two of them would walk hand in hand back to the house. The hooter went. She was excited. She could hear the clip, clop, clip, clop, clip of the miners' boots up on the cobblestones, those who were going to the work and those who were coming away. And she did look, and she could see her father, and the two of them walked hand in hand, side by side, back into the house on this, the Christmas Eve. She took off her coat and she hung it up upon a peg. But to be honest, it didn't change shape. It held her body shape, because of all of the clay dust and the brick dust held it in its shape, her body shape. Her father was smiling, but he wasn't going to say what it was. For a moment she wondered whether he'd got a present for her, but he knew that he didn't have enough money to do that. But there was something in the pack and the sack at his back that he had that was very heavy. They all sat down. They ate their tea of oatcakes and coal. But the father was still smiling. "Whatever is it?" his wife asked. "Whatever is it?" she asked. And from out of that pack and that sack at his back, he pulled out a huge lump of coal. Well, they had coal anyway. The miners were given buckets of coal free. But this coal fire would draw air through the house, and perhaps it was that kept her healthy. But this was the biggest lump of coal that she'd ever seen, and he placed it on the fire. And he sat down, and they might not have had much, and they might not have had presents, but he sat down by the side of the fire by the glow of that huge lump of coal. And for the first time that she could ever remember, on the Christmas Eve, he told stories about her grandfather, the stories that the grandfather had told to her father, and she listened. And for just a moment on a Christmas Eve, they listened, and they were far away in the valleys when they were still green, when the farms had oats and corn growing in them, when they didn't just have cattle for food and horses to help pull the heavy trams. And she would always remember when she changed from a girl to a woman, that look on her sister's face when on Christmas morning she handed over a small wooden horse. Everyone knew him as Bob, but that wasn't his name. As the regimental sergeant major was shouting at the new volunteers to call out their names, the rest of his workmates looked and gasped when they heard him say that his name was Benjamin. They'd always known him as Bob. He was a tall man, kind and loud, 30 years old, and he had lived in Ebbw Vale ever since his grandfather had brought his father to this place. His grandfather came from Scotland. They'd heard about the ironworks. They'd heard about the steelworks. They'd heard about the fact that there was more work here in South Wales than anywhere else in the rest of the country. And now, Bob, whose real name was Benjamin, was standing in line, for he'd volunteered on the second day of the war to work in the army. He'd signed up. He didn't have to sign up. Working in the steelworks meant that he was in an industry that the war needed, and he didn't have to sign up. And his wife had told him so. She'd spoken to him and said, "I don't know what you're going to do now that you've gone. What are we going to do? You've got 2 children. There are other men younger than you." But Bob was determined. This was the first day of a new beginning for him. He was going to join the army like his grandfather had before him. He was patriotic. He wanted to save his country. And now, after he'd said goodbye to all of his workmates, he was standing in line and ready to go to war. He had no illusions about what war would be like. His grandfather had told him how in the First World War it had been like a factory that could make men die quicker than you could sigh or blink. But he was not going to let his country be overrun. He'd said goodbye to his workmates. He'd had to tear himself away from his 2 children and his wife. And now he was standing there. And as he stood tall and straight, you could feel his shoulders further back. His muscles from the work that he'd done inside of the steelworks were strong. But after it had just been rebuilt, he was going to go off to war. He was proud of his country, proud of every last single scrap of this country, from Scotland, where his grandparents were from, to South Wales, for his king and for his country. Around his neck, he had a small doll that his father had given to him, that had been given to him by Bob's grandfather. It was a small doll that was made out of iron and steel. It was jointed and it moved and it had 2 legs. It was no longer than your thumb from the top of its head to the tip of its iron shoes. But the grandfather had made it out of small pieces of scrap iron and steel. And now he had it around his neck. He wasn't expecting a bullet to be bounced from it as it would protect him. But it was like a lucky charm, and he had it. And as he walked with his shoulders straight and his arms by his side, he could feel the small doll at his neck moving its legs backwards and forwards. And as he walked with more determination, he could feel the small iron doll moving. It wasn't this that really made him feel happy and strong and protected. For his father had given him something that would be brought out on high days and holidays to show to the whole family. It was a revolver. A revolver that, to Bob, when he was a child, and when he was called Benjamin, it always smelt of smoke. Not like the smoke that came from out of the foundry and the workshop, but it smelt of smoke that he could barely put a name to. His grandfather had said it smelled like the smoke that they would use in the limestone quarries, where they would drill holes, fill it with gunpowder, set it alight, and blow all of the limestone to smithereens. He'd warned Bob that that would be what it would be like on the battlefield. Explosions all around him. But this gun was inside of his pocket. It was a revolver, a German revolver that his father had taken when he had fought in the First World War. And now he could touch it. He could feel it. To him, it smelt of victory. That's what he thought. It felt like it was going to make him victorious. It smelt of victory. And this German revolver, with a maker's mark engraved in silver, was going to be the thing that would save him in this, the Second World War. He'd been happy to volunteer. He wrote letters to his father. He couldn't say too much about where he was, but just give him an indication of how the war was progressing. He'd had to use the revolver on more than one occasion. He almost felt as if it protected him. But towards the end of the war, things were not going well on the battlefield for Bob and his companions. He'd fought long and hard to get to this place, and now he could see that the Germans were making one last advance towards him. The revolver still smelt of victory, but it was rusty now, and it had no more bullets. None of the men had any more bullets. He wondered what he could do. He could hardly take the small iron doll from around his neck and throw it at those men. But he did take it and held it in his hand, and now it seemed to fall apart. This was his lucky charm, and it had fallen apart. But when it landed upon the ground, he noticed that down each of the iron legs there was a sharp blade, almost like a pair of scissors. And when he clicked it together, it no longer looked just like a small iron soldier. It was a sharp blade, a penknife. What could he do with a penknife to stop the whole of these crazed men who wanted to at least gain some scrap of victory from the end of the war? This is from a time before this time. There were no mobiles, there were no ways that they could communicate that did not involve wires. And it was almost as if, by the last dying rays of the sun, the blade was like a mirror, and it lit down to the ground, and the only means of communication was by wire, from one of the German posts to another. And he used that penknife well. He used it. He could cut the wires, and now the enemy could not tell each other which way to go, and they fell into disarray. And then, when reinforcements came, it was they who were captured, and not Bob. He was commended. He was given a medal for valour and victory and ingenuity. I think perhaps he was the first soldier ever to be awarded a medal for simply having a penknife and cutting off communication. He would take that penknife. When he had his own grandchildren upon his knee, he would fold it back together so that it was in the shape of a small iron soldier. But they would listen to the story that he would tell about how a single penknife helped their grandfather to win the war.
From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and family, workmates brought the light from the dark. For ships and trains and iron, industry and home, we pull black diamonds from the earth. All hail to King Paul. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. No one talks of danger underneath the ground. We're the heartbeat of this nation, of that we can be proud. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. Now once there was a mine here, but now the pit has gone. There's no more working underground, but the memory lingers on. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and family, workmates brought the light from the dark. Now the pit is closing, Mother Nature takes a hand. There's no more filthy slag heaps in this green and pleasant land. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. For ships and trains and iron, industry and home, we pull black diamonds from the earth. All hail to King Paul. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and family, workmates brought the light from the dark. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Families, friends and workmates brought the light.
Limestone, iron ore, coke and sweat. Its pride in the valleys don't ever forget. Fire and iron, smoke and steel. The scars in the earth man and nature can't heal. Limestone, iron ore, coke and sweat. Its pride in the valleys don't ever forget. Fire and iron, smoke and steel. The scars in the earth man and nature can heal. Limestone, iron ore, coke and sweat. Its pride in the valleys don't ever forget. Fire and iron, smoke and steel. The scars in the earth man and nature can heal. Limestone, iron ore, coke and sweat. Its pride in the valleys don't ever forget. Fire and iron, smoke and steel. The scars in the earth man and nature can't heal.
I work on the mine bank picking and sorting the iron ore for Richard Evan. I work from 6:30 in the morning until 6 in the evening, but I do have an hour off at noon for my dinner. My reward for work is meat or clothes or a little money, perhaps a shilling a month. I like my work very well. I have good health. I do not lose any days. I was never in a day school, but I go to Sunday school. I try to learn, but I cannot read yet. I work at the same time as men. I cannot say whether I'm 8 years old or not. I only go to Sunday school. I can say the spelling of 2 letters. I do not know what I get.
When I was 15, I've come here from Swansea to work underground, for girls at Swansea cannot work as they can here. When I worked the levels, helping the miner, I used to bore holes for blasting down the mine, and then pick it out of the rubbish, or stuff and shovel it, and fill it into the tram, and help to push the tram off to the mainway, and do all the light work, the same as the men did, except in the powder. Now that I'm working on the mine banks, I get 7 and 6pence a week for picking, cleaning, stacking the mine and unloading it from the trams. This is all heavy work. Recently, I have married, and my husband earns from £4 to £5 a month. I regularly go to chapel and Sunday school, but I've never been to a day school. But I cannot read. Not many girls working about the mines can read.
I work for 12 hours and at night with the others, working in the forges and mills, sweeping out, keeping clean the ways and the plates they drag the iron over. I earn about 3 shillings a week. I have been in no school except Sunday school. I can't read. My father was killed in a colliery and now I'm employed. I earn nearly 4 shillings a week. I work the same time as the colliers, about 12 hours every day. I go to work at 6 in the morning. I was in school a little while and go every Sunday, but I cannot read. I like the work very well, but I'd rather be at home. I started work here when I was 9 years old, but 3 years later. When I was 12, I lost my arm in the rolls. It was taken off near the socket. I was then hooking up behind the rolls and fell down and my arm was drawn in. I was a long time ill, but I'm well now. I could do a little. I go to chapel and Sunday school sometimes, but not always, because I have to be on duty for the loco engine, as it travels through the gates on Sundays, with the forges to the furnaces.
I began to work in a mine level in about 1863. I was carried into work on my father's back and earned 1 and 6 a week. My hours were from 12 to 14 hours a day. Each candle lasted 3 to 3.5 hours, and 4 candles were used in a day. I was hidden in a mine stall on one occasion to avoid the mine inspector, who came to see whether the regulations forbidding the employment of children under 10 were being observed.
My name's Tony Wilson, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some different methods of trying to write stories with children. Now, what I'm going to show you is for your benefit, not to show to the children straight away. From the very early stages, you would introduce the 5 questions of who, where, what, why and when. And you get the children to understand this. Now, there is a song on the CD which is who, where, what, why, don't forget when. Hopefully the children will take this on board and they will find themselves like remembering almost by osmosis, because they've sung the song since they were in nursery. But it is difficult if you're looking at a single sheet of white paper and somebody's expecting you to write. Well, one of the things that you've got to show children are that there are 5 questions. 5 questions that people ask about a story. And those questions all start with a W and an H. And even when the children are very small, there is no reason why you won't expect them to write this up. But there is no reason why they can't be introduced to the idea of showing 5 fingers of who, where, what, why and when. It does come in handy when the children are older. And what you're going to do is you're going to show them that there are 5 questions that people ask. Well, who are the characters? What is the plot? And if you say that to children so that they have a kind of a rhyme, which is, what is the plot? What is happening inside of the story? And I'm sure we've all come across those stories where there's lots of description, but nothing actually happens. So, who are the characters? What is the plot? When is part of the setting, so that you have who, what, when, where, again, part of the setting. And the last one, which is often quite difficult, And it's very interesting to ask children, after you've told them a simple story with the very young ones, if you've told them a story of, say, Goldilocks, and you ask them, why did Goldilocks go wandering off? And they'll come up with some quite surprising answers. So you've got the 5 questions. Who, where, what, why and when, but not necessarily in that order. And you introduce children to those 5 questions, and then, when they're older, when they're getting towards the end of Key Stage 1, you tell them that their job as an author is to tell people how. And this is the writing part. Again, if I can just emphasise that this is for you to understand the content of a story. We all go to college and we're told to write stories, but if you know and understand the formula behind a story, then you've got a good basis that you can help the children to understand what it is that is needed inside of a story. When you're answering the questions for people who are wanting to read a decently constructed story. Well, the job is, as an author, and tell the children when they're really young that they are authors, so that they get used to the name of author. They are writing for a purpose, they're writing for somebody else to read. And if you say to them, the most important person who's ever going to read your work is you. 5 questions. And now we start to give the answers. Well, one of the answers is how it can be described using adjectives. Well, in the booklet we talk about getting the children to close their eyes, because if I was to tell them a story and say there was a fish, then it's not a very good story. But if they close their eyes, and you try it now, close your eyes, because there is a fish. It's as wide as my hand and as long as my arm, with 2 beautiful round golden eyes and blood red fins at its neck. It swims through the water as fast as a bird can fly in the clear blue air, but when it comes to the top of the calm, calm sea, then its voice sounds like honey in the air. And then you get the children to open their eyes, and they should get used to the idea that through description you are painting a picture with words. That is all we are trying to do, paint a picture with words. But again, this is for you. So how is the description using adjectives? How someone feels using emotions. And I've always found that a good way, when you're telling a story to even the youngest of children, to talk about the heart as a means of description for emotion, rather than sad, happy. And even from year 5s and 6s, I've had very sad and very happy. Talk about how the heart feels. His heart felt like a stone inside of his chest. There wasn't a single part of her heart that hadn't been broken into a million pieces of glass. You must emphasise that it's not just sad and happy. Description, feelings, senses, the 5 senses. What do we get? Ours is a very visual society, and it's all about how wide, how long, what colour it is. We'll get the children to use 5 senses, and one of the ways to get children used to this is by telling a story where someone eats something, so they can talk about how it tastes. Get somebody to walk past a butcher's shop and talk about the disgusting smell, or past a drain or past a river and talk about the smell, or maybe just about the sounds, or get someone to lose a shoe so they can talk about how the ground feels on their feet. In all of this, it's necessary for you to model it so that description is used all of the time, feelings are used using the heart, senses are used. Well, there's one thing that we get children to put into their stories right from a very age, and that's talk. Well, you will need to have talk. Even in the reception, the children would write, "I see my dad," "I say hello," and things like this. And when you're getting towards the end of Key Stage 1, you're starting to get the children to try and work away from said and said and said and said. And one of the things that you can emphasise, and this is something that I do not introduce until we get towards the latter end of Key Stage 2, where you start to talk about, to get the children to write this, because you'll have been doing it within your storytelling, but to get the children to write it, you talk about how the voice sounds. And the way that you can get this across is by saying to the children, "Help," he shouted. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But help, his voice was filled with fear and anger. And you've talked about feelings, and you haven't mentioned how the words were actually spoken. Help, his voice was rattling and echoing in that empty place. And with that, you've used the setting. But if you put the two of them together, it comes out, help, his voice was filled with fear and anger and rattled and echoed in that empty place. And now you've got a much more mature way of actually describing the way that it was talked. Now, I'll give you an idea of how you can show children how this works. This is not what you would show to the children in reception. What you would have is a board with these 5 questions on. And when the children come up to you and go, "I don't know what to write," well, you can put 5 fingers in front of them and say, who is going to do something in this story? What are they going to do? When are they going to do it? Where and why? And it saves that long queue of 17 children all saying that they're stuck with a story when you go like that. It puts the emphasis on them to actually construct the story. And they know that there's a structure now. So, if I tell the story and say, "I fell off a wall," it's not enough. But if I say, "When I was younger, my friends were always daring me to walk on a wall, and I never would, but one day, when the sun was shining high in the sky and looked like a great golden coin, we were walking by the side of the old park. The old park that was filled with trees that are strong and tall and look like soldiers. Well, there was a wall, but it was no higher than my hip. And with their teeth together, they hissed at me, 'Go on, get up on the wall.' Well, it was only as high as my hip. And up I got on top of the old brown crumbling bricks. And as I walked along the wall, I started to show off. I started to dance this way and that. And it was when I was dancing on top of the wall that my foot slipped. Well, the wall might have been as high as my hip on one side, but it was taller than me on the other. And I found myself falling down towards the thin roof of the insect house of the zoo. And then I fell through that roof and found myself surrounded by 1,000 man-eating spiders. And you've got a choice. I fell off a wall, or the second one that has who were my friends and me, what, I walked on the wall, when, it was a sunny day because the sun was in the sky, where did it happen, on top of the wall, by the side of the zoo, in the old park, and why did I walk on top of the wall? Because my friends dared me to. I didn't want to look foolish. Young children will come up with very surprising answers for why. And that's the way that you would introduce this within the Key Stage 1. Key Stage 2, now you've got a chance to show this. This I wouldn't introduce until perhaps year 5 and year 6, talking about the voice sounds. But children will be used to listening to it because you will have modelled it. Well, I could say there was a boy in the forest. And it's not much of a story. But if you start to use all of this structure to show children how their writing can become more mature, you say, the boy was nearly as tall as a man and stood by the side of that empty forest. The moon was in the sky like a great silvered coin, but a fine breeze blew his yellow hair away from his eyes, and with his thin fingers clasped together, his voice, no louder than a whisper, rattled and echoed in that empty place. Oh, I wish that I had never come away from the wall. He took a step, and as he looked at the trees, he could see that they held leaves on their branches, and each of the leaves had all of the colours of the rainbow within them. But it was the sound that they made, a soft and a gentle thud as they hit the ground. And on he walked through that place, his feet being cut by the fine gravel and it crunched and rattled and echoed in that place, and there was a smell of death in the air. You've got a choice. The boy walked through the forest, or the second that had description. I forgot to put in feelings, but his heart was heavy in his chest. Senses, talked about the smell of death, talked about what he could hear. His talk was no bigger than a whisper, rattled and echoed in that empty place. And there you have a much more fulfilling read for the children to understand that they need to put 5 questions and 5 answers. For older children, you can introduce it in the way of saying, it's not just the 5 questions that you used to have when you were in the infants. Now, it's 2 handfuls, and it's not whatever. It's who, where, what, why, and when, descriptions, feelings, senses, talk, and the way that the talk sounds. Well, one last part within this is the fact that a story has 3 parts. Now, I know that people have dissected stories into 7 parts and talked about character, conclusion, and dilemma. I find, and this has been developed over 7 years, since 1999, I've been developing this so that children have a means of understanding about story, and I tend to go for beginning, middle, and end. Well, if you put those letters together, beginning, middle, and end, together they spell out be me. And that's the whole point. When I'm telling a story, I need you to be me. I need you to be able to see what I can see inside of my head. I need to make sure that I have committed it to the way that I've spoken it or written it, so that you can be me. And that is the question that children should ask themselves when they are reviewing the work. Can whoever's reading this be me?